Welcome. We're going to look at some cultural diffusion in Greek civilization. And particularly, we're going to look at the political structures that are going to develop in ancient Greece. Okay, you're going to need your notebook. Um, your notes are going to be found in either yellow or bold black print. Um, Also, get you a sheet of paper just to answer the few questions that you'll have. You'll be turning that in tomorrow. Title this Ancient Greece, Sparta versus Athens. All right. In terms of ancient Greece, one of the main things that we want to focus on is that this is going to be the birthplace of democracy. Okay. They looked at a lot of things in terms of um, development. Um, they're going to study free will, whether or not the gods exist. But the most important idea that's going to come out of ancient Greece is they're going to look at government, all the different functions of government. Um, Now, they didn't just jump to democracy. They're going to try several different forms of political systems. Um, and as they tinker through them, they're going to stumble upon democracy. And you'll see that in the upcoming videos. All right. Now, when you're looking in this area right here, this is what we call a classical civilization, and basically, ancient Greece is the first of the classical civilizations. There were others. One of the things about it being a classical civilization is it is building on what happened during the ancient civilizations. So, in terms of what all the ideas that came out of Mesopotamia, um, right in here, and Egypt, right over here, best ideas are all going to wind up right here in ancient Greece. And you'll see why. But ancient Greece, they're going to leave their home and deal with these people, and they're going to pick the best ideas and bring them back here. All right. They're going to particularly have high levels of achievement in science and technology. All right. Now, looking at this map, you can see ancient Greece is full of mountains. It is loaded with mountains. The terrain is so mountainous that you can barely develop land for um, farming. And because of this, they're going to be more dependent on trade than they are on farming in terms of providing everything that they need. And since they were located on the Mediterranean Sea, they were in the perfect place to benefit everything that developed in Mesopotamia and Egypt.
But then Greece also seemed an unlikely land to give rise to greatness.
If you look at the physical world of Greece, it's not the kind of place that you'd immediately expect to produce a great civilization. Simply too many mountains. Greece does not have the obvious kind of physical unity that typically seems to be associated with the really great imperial civilizations of the ancient world.
The great civilizations of Cleisthenes' day lay to the south and east, in Egypt and Persia. They had grown up around rivers and the fertile plains stretching from their banks. But mainland Greece had no great rivers or open plains. This was a landscape riven by mountain ranges. Off her coast lay countless tiny islands. It was impossible for a single ruler to dominate this fragmented world. Instead, Greece was divided into countless tiny nations called city-states, each fiercely independent, each with its own culture and history.
Now, looking at these mountains in ancient Greece, two major problems going to come up. One is going to be lack of farmland because of rivers and mountains. And the other one is isolation. Okay, too many mountains, Because, I mean, if you're trying to connect to a neighboring city, it makes it kind of tough if you got to climb a mountain to get there. Okay. Now, because of the mountains, each city-state develops in isolation. All right. The Greek city-states are what we call polis. Okay. Polis just simply means city. All right, or anything of to do with the city. In terms of polis, you think about it today. You think about politics, politician, metropolitan. All of these come from the Greek word polis. Now, there are several key polises in ancient Greece: Athens, Syracuse, Thebes. Okay, but there are two in particular that are going to really dominate the landscape. Right? And those two are going to be the ones that we're going to focus on today. Okay, and like I said, Athens and Sparta. Okay, completely different than each other. Um, Athens, I want you to think of this as more like the Democratic Party. All right, of course, they come up with the idea of democracy. And then the Spartans are more like the Republican Party, a little more conservative, and you'll see a lot of the ideas. One of the reasons I colored them in red and blue. Let's start off with Athens. Okay, Athens, like I said, is going to be the foundation of what we call democracy today. They didn't automatically jump to it. Okay, it was a step-by-step process. Started off with a leader named Draco, who's going to form his own code, sort of like Hammurabi's code, except for he's going to make one major difference. All people, no matter what your wealth, were equal before the eyes of the law. That's going to be hugely, hugely um, influential. Now, these laws were extremely harsh for the times, but all people were subject to those harsh laws. The second person is a guy named Solon. Solon is going to outlaw something called debt slavery, which is going to be a major part in terms of lifting the constraints off of the poor, okay, and allowing them to have upward mobility. Now, if you look at Athenian society, we're talking about individuality, education, okay, but key thing that they stressed in education was art and science. Art and science. Um, Not military. Art and science, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But military was important because, as you see, boys did have to join the military for 2 years when they turned 18. And then you would return back home and go to work in whatever area that your father worked in. So if your father was a blacksmith, you went back and you learned how to become a blacksmith. If your father was a farmer, you went and became a farmer. Now the big difference here is I want you to see how girls were treated, women. Um, Women were raised to be the wives of mothers, okay? But they were not citizens in and of themselves. They had very few rights. Um, Everything that they had came through a male. So if a woman's husband and father both died, like say they both died in battle, or they both died through sickness or something to that nature, and the woman was left all alone, she would have to, all of her wealth would be transferred to her closest relative, who was a male. So that's going to be really different than when we look at the Spartans. We're going to develop a much more conservative society, but even though it's more conservative, women are going to have better rights. Sparta was highly militarized, and one of the reasons that it was militarized was because they conquered a neighboring group. Not only one, but the main neighboring group they conquered were the Helots. And what they used these different neighboring groups for was to provide services to Spartan society. So, like the Helots provided food, There was another group that they conquered that provided manufacturing. And each group is going to provide something that the Spartans needed. But in order to maintain control over those groups, you had to have a strong military. And so everything in Sparta was developed around the military. All right. And because everything is around the military, they're going to value duty, strength, and discipline. All right. To an extreme, like no other society that we've looked at before. Um, well, I guess you could say comparable to the um, Assyrians. The ancient Assyrians were centered around the military as well, but not to the degree that the Spartans were. Okay, and because all of the men are away taking care of the military, women are left to run the businesses, to make sure the cities function. They're taking care of the business of Sparta. And because of that, they're going to have quite a few more opportunities. Now, um, if we go back to 508 BC, Athens is having a major problem. And someone is going to come along, and this is when we're going to have our first step toward real democracy. Let's look at some other forms of government that were around at that time. All right, monarchy, of course. This is one that I would probably say the oldest form of government. This is where you have a king that's in charge. The king is going to make all of the rules. His rules is based on um, who his father was. He's going to inherit um, his rule from his father, and then he'll pass it on to his son, and therefore on and on and on. All right, and where they get their power from is believed that the gods chose them to rule. We call this divine right, and this is something that you're going to see again: divine right. The next form of government is a little more um, a little more you can see it steps away. So with the monarchy, you got one person in charge. With the aristocracy, you're ruled by the nobility. That is, the people who were related to the king, now they have taken control for themselves, and you have a few nobles who are going to make all of the decisions. Okay, so you got ruled by a few now, and their rule is based on who they are related to. Okay, so rule is based on family ties. All right, and this is the form of government that was practiced in Athens during the time of stress that they were having. Now, oligarchy. Okay, very similar to aristocracy. Very similar, except for here, rule is based on ability. All right, and particularly as practiced in Spartan. Okay, in Spartan life, if you serve the military honorably until about age 60, that means you've been to war several times, you survived, you're considered a great leader at that point. And amongst the great leaders that survive at age 60, they form a group called, that we call oligarchs. They call them the Council of Elders, and they're going to make all of the decisions in Sparta. Now, back to Athens. Athens was having huge problems, and they called upon one of their older citizens who had actually been kicked out. They brought him back, and they wanted him to help set up a new government. And this is going to give birth to something that we call now democracy.
The year was 508 BC. This would be Athens' first step to empire and glory. For the first time in recorded history, the people had turned on their rulers. and seized power for themselves. At this new dawn, the Athenian people now turned to one man. A figure whose life, whose experiences and disappointments had given him a unique vision. Cleisthenes was recalled from exile and asked to build a government.
When Cleisthenes returned to Athens after the expulsion of the Spartans, he faced a really remarkable challenge. There was no possibility for just simply putting back in power a group of aristocrats. There was no possibility for him to declare himself tyrant. In a sense, what Cleisthenes had to do is design a revolutionary governmental solution for a revolutionary political situation.
For Cleisthenes, the problem was how to give his fellow Athenians the say in their future that he knew they must now have. On an Athenian hillside, he had a great meeting place carved out from the bare rock. Here, in the shadow of the Acropolis, the citizens of Athens could now gather to discuss the future of their state. On these very steps, rich and poor alike could stand and address their fellow citizens. This is the ancestor of the British House of Commons, the American Congress, of parliaments across the world. And where government had once been decided by the strength of a sword arm or the thrust of a sharpened spear, Cleisthenes instituted the simple vote. A white pebble for yes, a black pebble for no. And with this elegant and simple idea, Cleisthenes instituted the rule of the people. A system of government which we now know as democracy. The Great Athenian Assembly would gather every 9 days to vote on issues covering the entire administration of the state, from the raising of taxes to the building of roads, from the price of figs to the declaration of war.
Democracy represented a sharp break. An originally elitist, heroic culture was now turned on its head, and the idea was that even ordinary Greeks who weren't aristocratic, who were not rich, could be, as it were, heroes in politics.
It was a system of government that would transform this tiny state, and would set off one of the greatest flowerings of civilization the world had ever seen.
And this sets up democracy. All right? And this type of rule is it's not going to last long, but it's going to be instituted in Athens for a time period. And for us, this sets the stage for our modern governments today. Thing that you have to understand is that this is ruled by the citizens, and majority makes the law. That is, so you tally up the vote, everyone has a say, and then we look at the majority, and that's what we're going to go with. All right. Notice that they said Cleisthenes, he did not become a tyrant. Now, tyrant you tend to think of as being harsh or cruel, but back then, a tyrant was just a noble who would seize power, and usually did it in the interest of the people. So this was a little bit different than how we think of tyrant. Okay, please answer these 3 questions. may pause it to think about it, or go back and look at your notes. After you finish these 3 questions, continue. Now, looking at Greek culture is going to get a major influence from the Mesopotamians. You can see it directly in their writing because the Sumerians developed writing with cuneiform. The Phoenicians are going to borrow, simplify, add to cuneiform. And that writing that the Phoenicians is going to develop is going to wind up in ancient Greece. The Greeks are going to further simplify and add to it and come up with their own alphabet. Some of it you may recognize when you look at like the letter A. The letter A is pretty much the same as the letter A as we have. The letter B is pretty much the same as the letter B. You can look here at the D. Here's their D, delta. Okay, and here's our D. All right, it's a little different. Of course, we have E and they have E, but notice that there's no F and no G. Okay, so things began to change a little bit as we go. But now, how did the Greeks get this form of writing? How did it come to them? All right, and this goes back to the key term that we talked about at the very beginning, cultural diffusion. Okay, cultural diffusion by way of trade. You can also see this in their god. Greeks were polytheists. In their mythology or their gods, that they gave them human qualities. The gods were immortal, but they gave them human qualities. That is, the gods could get mad at you, and the gods could bless you, depending on what you did. All right. Now their gods, the way they set it up, was very similar to how the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians, to some degree, set up their gods. So a lot was borrowed in terms of ideas about culture from the Mesopotamians and the Greeks, from the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians. Now, everyone didn't believe in the gods. In particular, there were 3 men who are going to set the stage for what we call philosophs or philosophy. One is going to be Socrates, the other is Plato, and then of course Aristotle. Socrates is the teacher of teachers, right? Considered the greatest teacher in the world. He was the teacher of Plato, and Plato is going to be the teacher of Aristotle. Key thing is they're going to use logic to try to understand nature rather than religion. Well, that's pretty much it about ancient Greece. It gives you a foundation. As they moved on and became more powerful, they're going to start to colonize nearby territories, and this is going to put them into direct conflict with a growing superpower at that time, old ancient Persia. The Persians were on the march for building their huge empire, and you had little itty bitty Greece who stood in their way. And this sets up probably something that you've already seen. We're going to actually look at it in class, or a piece of it anyway. 300.
Greek's architecture, philosophy, literature, the very word music comes from Greek, as does so much else in contemporary culture. Greek poets and mathematicians and architects and philosophers founded a culture that we still identify with, and they introduced us to many ideas, from democracy to fart jokes. And the Greeks gave the West our first dedicated history, they gave us our vocabulary for talking about politics, plus they gifted us our idealization of democracy, which comes from the government they had in Athens. Mr.